I live alone in a small but comfortable apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I've always loved the independence and peace this place provides, especially because it has a small balcony that overlooks the building's inner garden. It's the kind of place where you feel safe, you know? I never really worried much about extra locks or alarms. My job as a graphic designer is remote, so I spend most of my time at home, which always gave me a sense of control over my environment. But a few weeks ago, strange things started happening, and that sense of security turned into something I never imagined. At first, it was small things, almost easy to ignore. A door I was sure I'd closed before going to bed would be ajar in the morning. A cup I always left in the cupboard would appear in the sink. Even my phone charger, which stays beside my bed, was unplugged one night. Initially, I thought it was just my distraction or maybe paranoia from spending too much time alone. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more the details seemed wrong. I started writing everything down, as if trying to prove to myself that I wasn't making it up. That's when I realized these little incidents were happening more often. After a few restless nights, I decided to take action. I bought a simple security camera, the kind you set up yourself and connect to your phone. I placed it in the corner of the living room, facing the hallway that leads to the bedrooms and the balcony. I didn't expect to find anything. In fact, I was trying to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The setup was quick, and that night, I went to bed a bit more relaxed, thinking the camera would clear up any doubts. But when I woke up the next morning, I found the balcony door slightly open again. The chill that ran down my spine was instant. I knew I'd closed it before going to bed. I was certain. Heart racing, I grabbed my phone to review the camera footage. At first, everything seemed normal. Me walking to my bedroom, turning off the lights, the apartment completely silent. But then, around 3 a.m., I saw something that made my stomach churn. The balcony door slowly slid open, as if being carefully opened. A shadow moved through the room, moving slowly, almost deliberately. I couldn't see the face or details of the person, but it was clearly someone. They stayed in the room for a few minutes, moving things around, and then disappeared down the hallway toward my bedroom. My hand trembled as I paused the video. Someone had been in my home while I was sleeping. At that moment, I felt a mix of panic and disbelief. How could this have happened? My balcony didn't have direct access to the ground floor, so how did someone manage to get up there? My mind raced in all directions, trying to understand what was happening. I decided to keep watching the footage, my heart in my throat. The shadow came back to the living room about 15 minutes later, moving with the same chilling calm. And then, as if nothing had happened, the person left through the balcony door, closing it behind them. Whoever it was knew exactly how to come and go without making a sound. And the most disturbing part, they seemed comfortable as if they had done it before. I spent the rest of the day trying to figure out what to do. I called the building management, but they had no record of anyone strange in the garden. I also called the police, but they were vague, saying I could file a report and suggesting I reinforce the locks. I didn't feel any safer after that. That night, I moved every piece of furniture I could to block the balcony door and decided to sleep with the hallway light on. I needed a solution, but fear paralyzed me. The thought that someone could enter again, maybe with more sinister intentions, wouldn't leave my mind. The next night, even with the door blocked, I couldn't relax. Every little sound seemed amplified. Every shadow on the walls seemed to move. I decided to stay awake, holding my phone like it was a weapon, ready to check the camera footage at any moment. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard something that made my heart race. The soft sound of metal scraping, coming from the direction of the balcony. I ran to the live feed on my phone and saw the door moving again. This time, the furniture I'd placed in front was blocking the way. The person was outside trying to get in, pushing slowly, almost silently. My whole body froze. I didn't know what to do. My first reaction was to call the police, but my biggest fear was that if I made any noise, the person could get in before help arrived. So, with shaking hands, I texted the building's emergency line, begging for help. Meanwhile, I stayed still, watching the camera. The person outside seemed to give up on pushing the door. For a moment, everything went silent. But then I saw their face, They crouched down to the camera's level, staring directly at it, as if they knew they were being filmed. The smile they gave was cold, calculated. They knew exactly what they were doing. That smile paralyzed me. It was as if they knew I was watching, that they were terrorizing me on purpose. My heart raced even faster when they stood up and moved out of the camera's view. I had no idea where they were or if they had given up on getting in. Seconds felt like hours as I waited for the police or someone from the building to show up. I tried not to make any noise, but the anxiety made me breathe too loudly. When I finally heard footsteps in the hallway, I rushed to the front door. It was the building security guard, accompanied by a police officer. I opened the door, almost in tears, trying to explain everything at once. They searched the apartment and the balcony area but found no one. Only the marks on the door and the camera footage confirmed that I wasn't imagining things. The police officer got straight to the point. You need to reinforce the locks immediately. This kind of thing can escalate. I spent the rest of the night awake, trying to process what had happened. The next day, I installed extra locks on the balcony and hired a company to put bars on the access. But the fear never fully went away. I always have the sense that they might come back, or that someone like them might try again. The worst part was knowing that they knew exactly what they were doing. Breaking in, terrorizing, and leaving me with a scar that might never disappear. When I was 16, my parents decided, for the first time, to leave me home alone for the weekend. They were going to visit some relatives out of town, and since finals were coming up, I thought it was a great idea to stay and study. Our house is in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by friendly neighbors and a tall gate. So even though it was my first time being home alone, I wasn't too worried. The first night was peaceful. I made instant noodles, played video games late into the night, and went to bed feeling a sense of freedom. But things started to change the next night when the phone rang for the first time. It was almost midnight, and I was in the living room watching TV when the landline rang. That was already strange because my parents always called on their cell phones. I hesitated but picked it up. There was nothing on the other end. "Hello," I said again, but the silence was absolute. I hung up, thinking it might have been a prank or a wrong number. I went back to the couch, trying not to dwell on it, but about half an hour later, the phone rang again. The same silence. This time, I stayed on the line longer, trying to catch any sound, and that's when I heard something faint in the background. It sounded like rustling, like someone moving papers or leaves. That's when the uneasy feeling started to set in. After that second call, I began to feel unsettled. My heart was beating faster, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just someone fumbling with paper or a pocket while dialing the wrong number. To distract myself, I went back to my video game, but my attention was entirely on the phone. The house, which had always felt so safe, now seemed full of shadows and noises I hadn't noticed before. About an hour later, the phone rang again. This time, I hesitated before answering. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. The same silence greeted me at first, but then, something different, a muffled sound, like slow, heavy breathing. I hung up immediately, my nerves completely on edge. I thought about calling my parents, but I didn't want them to think I couldn't handle being alone. Instead, I texted my best friend, Lucas, explaining what was happening. He tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just some idiot playing a prank. That calmed me down for a bit, but then the phone rang again. This time I didn't answer, but the sound of it ringing through the empty house felt like it was mocking me. I decided to unplug the landline, thinking that would end it. My relief was short-lived. My cell phone vibrated almost immediately, and when I looked, it was an unknown number. Seeing the unknown number on my phone made my breath catch. I answered with a shaky voice, trying to sound firm. "Who are you? What do you want?" Once again, no response. But this time, the background noise was different. It wasn't silence or breathing. It was something else. I heard what sounded like a faint creaking, like wooden floorboards being stepped on. My stomach dropped. Was this person inside my house? I ran to check all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked, adrenaline coursing through me. The thought that someone could be so close was terrifying. Then I heard it. A sound that froze me in place. The ringtone of a cell phone. My phone had stopped ringing, but the same ringtone was faintly echoing, distant yet clear. I walked to the living room window and peeked outside, my heart pounding. The street was dark, but when I looked toward the driveway, I saw something that made me freeze. A faint glow was coming from a phone lying on the ground, right in the middle of the driveway. The phone was ringing, playing the exact same ringtone as mine. Whoever it was, they were just a few yards away from me. I closed the curtain with trembling hands, my mind racing for a solution. I was alone, and now I knew this wasn't just a prank. I shut all the curtains and turned off the lights, trying to disappear inside my own house. My heart was pounding like a drum, and the sound of that phone ringing outside echoed in my head. I grabbed my phone and called Lucas, whispering as I tried to explain what was happening. Someone's here. Their phone is in my driveway, and they're calling me from it. Lucas was silent for a moment, probably trying to process if I was serious. Call the police right now, he finally said. My hands were shaking so much I could barely dial. Meanwhile, I tried to listen for any noise outside, but everything seemed terrifyingly quiet. When I finally managed to call the police, the dispatcher told me to stay calm and stay on the line while they sent a patrol car. Stay somewhere safe and don't make any noise, she said. But before I could respond, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A faint tapping on the living room window, like someone was gently testing the glass. It wasn't aggressive but calculated, almost like they were trying to taunt me. I crawled down the hallway, trying to get as far from the windows as possible, and stood there in the dark, clutching my phone. Every second felt like an eternity, and I expected to hear footsteps or see a shadow at any moment. I was completely vulnerable. The tapping eventually stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that was somehow worse. I imagined the person moving around, looking for another way in. Then I heard it again, the sound of the phone in the driveway. It had started ringing again, louder this time, like it was being picked up or moved. I didn't dare look outside again, but the sound was clear. Whoever it was, they were still there. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably just a few minutes, I heard the sound that gave me the most relief I'd felt all night. Tires pulling up and the flashing lights of a police car. When they opened the gate to the driveway, I heard footsteps and muffled voices outside. Soon after, one of the officers knocked on my front door, and I ran to open it. I tried to explain everything, but the words tumbled out in a rush. They searched the area with flashlights and found the phone in the driveway, but no sign of anyone. Whoever it was took off as soon as they saw us, one of the officers said. The phone was taken for investigation, but I never found out who it belonged to or how the person knew so much about me. After that night, my sense of security was never the same. I had my parents install cameras and reinforce the locks on the house, but I still have nightmares about the sound of that phone ringing in the driveway. To this day, I wonder what could have happened if I hadn't called for help in time. One thing's for sure. After that experience, I'll never stay alone without being completely prepared for anything. I moved into this house a few weeks ago. It was an incredible opportunity. A quiet neighborhood, friendly neighbors, and the price was much lower than I expected to pay. I didn't think twice. I didn't know anyone in the area, but that didn't bother me much. In fact, I thought it would be a great chance to have some time to myself. Working remotely let me organize my own schedule, and everything seemed perfect until I started noticing something strange. It was on a random night, while I was making a snack in the kitchen, that I looked out the window and saw something that made me uneasy. It was my next-door neighbor, standing in the middle of his lawn. He wasn't doing anything, no smoking, no phone in hand, nothing. He was just standing there, looking in the direction of my house. I watched for a while, waiting for him to move or do something to explain that strange position, but he didn't. After a few minutes, I decided to ignore it. Maybe he was lost in thought, I told myself. I went back to the couch and tried to forget about it, but the image of that unmoving man stuck in my head. That night, before I went to bed, I couldn't resist sneaking one last look out the window. He was still there. The next morning, I decided it might be a good idea to meet some neighbors and try to get a feel for the neighborhood. When I walked past the yard next door, I noticed it was completely empty. The grass was overgrown. There were some old boxes near the door, and the whole place had an abandoned air that felt out of place in such a well-kept neighborhood. For a moment, I thought about knocking on the door but decided against it. I didn't want to seem nosy. I convinced myself that the man I saw could have been a visitor or someone who left early. The following nights, however, proved me wrong. Every time I looked out the window after 10 p.m., he was there, always in the same spot with the same rigid posture, staring directly at my house. It was as if he was waiting for something. One time, I left the porch light on, thinking it might discourage him or at least make him move, but nothing changed. The uneasiness began to grow. Who was he, and why did no one else seem to notice? I decided that the next time I saw him, I would confront him, no matter how unsettling it felt. I needed answers. The next night, I mustered all the courage I had. When the clock hit 10 p.m., I went straight to the living room window, and there he was, standing in the same spot, with the same rigid posture and unflinching stare at my house. My breathing was heavy, but I decided it was now or never. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped out the front door. The air was cold, and each step I took seemed to echo in the silence of the neighborhood. "Hey, do you need something?" I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But he didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, like a statue. I approached him slowly, flashlight aimed directly at him. And as I got closer, the beam of light revealed something strange. His face seemed blurry, as if the light couldn't fully illuminate him. Frozen in place, I stared at him for what felt like hours. Then, something impossible happened. Without any visible movement, he simply vanished. No sound, no shadow darting away. He was there 1 second, and then he wasn't. I looked around, sweeping the yard with my flashlight, but there was no trace that anyone had been there. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I ran back to the house, locked the door, and sat on the couch, trying to process what had just happened. That night, I barely slept, the feeling of being watched refusing to leave me. The next day, I knew I needed answers. I spoke to a few neighbors, starting with the elderly couple who lived across the street. I asked if they knew who lived in the house next to mine. Their response sent chills down my spine. "That house? It's been empty for years," the woman said, frowning. "The last residents moved out over a decade ago, and no one's wanted to rent or buy it since. People say the place brings bad luck." I tried not to show my shock, but inside, everything felt like it was unraveling. Who, then, was the man I kept seeing? And why did he seem so fixated on my house? I went home more confused than ever. I decided to check out the property next door in daylight, hoping to find something that would explain what was happening. I hopped over the low fence and began exploring the yard. The grass was tall, as I had noticed before, but there were clear marks in the ground, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. However, when I looked at the windows of the house, they were covered in dust, with no signs of any recent activity. The feeling that something was terribly wrong only grew stronger. Then, as I turned to head back to my house, I noticed something odd. In the corner of the yard, buried among the weeds, was a small stone plaque, like an unmarked gravestone. I returned home with a cold chill running down my spine and even more questions than before. That night, fear kept me awake. Every sound in the house felt amplified. Every shadow in the corners of the rooms seemed to move. I waited anxiously for the moment he would reappear, but this time, I decided not to look out the window. I didn't want to see him. Then, around 10:30 p.m., my phone vibrated. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why are you here?" My body froze. I stared at the screen, trying to comprehend what was happening. Before I could respond or block the number, another message came through. "You don't belong here." Against my better judgment, I went to the window and peeked through the curtains. He was there again, in the same spot, but something was different. His posture seemed more relaxed, almost as if he were waiting for something or someone. This time, I didn't try to confront him. I just stood there, watching, until he disappeared again, just like before. No sound, no movement, just gone. The next day, I called a realtor and started looking for a new place to live. I never found out who or what he was, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I never got any answers, and I may never fully understand what happened. But one thing is certain: some houses or their neighbors simply don't want company. It was a quiet Saturday, and I was home alone, enjoying a rare moment of peace. My parents had gone to visit friends, and I decided to use the time to catch up on my favorite show. I spent the whole afternoon on the couch, snacking and basking in the silence of the house. Everything was perfectly normal until early evening when I went to the bathroom and noticed something strange. The door was locked from the inside. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to remember if I had used the bathroom that day. It didn't make sense. I was sure I hadn't locked the door. Half joking, I called out, "Hello? Is someone in there?" But the silence on the other side sent a chill down my spine. Grabbing a coin, I picked the lock, something I'd done before when the door got stuck. When I finally unlocked it, I pushed the door open slowly, expecting to find something. But the bathroom was empty. Everything seemed as it should be, except for one detail. The floor was wet. A thin trail of water led from the shower and extended out into the hallway. My heart started to race. That water wasn't supposed to be there. I tried to think rationally, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I followed the trail of water down the hallway, trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. The drops were spaced out, like someone had walked barefoot, leaving wet footprints on the wooden floor. They led to the hallway closet, the one I almost never opened because it only stored old junk. I stopped in front of the door, the sound of my own breathing filling my ears. My heart was pounding, but part of me kept insisting it was nothing, maybe just a leak. With a trembling hand, I turned the doorknob and pulled it open. What I found inside made me freeze. There was no one there, but something was out of place. A small, old blanket that was always folded neatly in the corner was crumpled, as though someone had wrapped themselves in it. On the floor, there were still damp footprints, like someone had been standing there for a while. And worst of all, there was a strange smell in the air, a mix of dampness and sweat. My hands began to sweat. Whoever it was had been there recently. My mind raced, trying to figure out how someone could have gotten in without me noticing. Most terrifying of all, I couldn't stop wondering where that person was now. I closed the closet door slowly, trying not to make a sound, as if I were afraid the person might still be nearby. My thoughts were a whirlwind. I ran to check every door and window in the house, starting with the front door. Everything was locked, just as I had left it. Still, the trail of water and the signs in the closet were real. I headed to the kitchen to grab my phone and call the police. But on the way, I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A soft creaking sound, wooden floorboards shifting, coming from upstairs. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. For a moment, I stood frozen, debating what to do. Should I go upstairs and check, or leave the house immediately? I decided not to take any chances. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911 as I made my way to the front door. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who urged me to leave the house and wait in a safe place until the police arrived. The moment I stepped outside, I ran to the sidewalk and stood there, staring at the house. Every shadow in the windows seemed to shift, but I couldn't tell if it was just my imagination. After a few minutes that felt like hours, a police car finally pulled up. The officers were quick and thorough. They entered the house with flashlights, checking every room while I waited outside, praying this was all just a misunderstanding. A few minutes later, one of the officers came out and called me over. "We didn't find anyone, but you need to see this." My heart was pounding as I followed the officer back into the house. He led me to the hallway closet where everything had started. When he opened the door, the first thing I noticed was that the blanket, which had only been crumpled before, now seemed more disturbed, as if it had been moved recently. But what caught my eye was something I hadn't noticed earlier: a small piece of paper taped to the inside wall of the closet. The officer handed me the note, and my hands trembled as I read it. Written in rushed, messy handwriting were the words, "You almost found me." My vision blurred, and the ground beneath my feet felt unsteady. I asked the officer what it meant, but he just shook his head, saying it appeared someone had been using my house as a hiding place. There were no signs of forced entry, which only made the situation more unsettling. After the officers finished searching the house, they recommended I change all the locks and install security cameras. I did so immediately, but from that night on, I never felt completely safe in my own home again.